Hello, this is David Sloan Wilson for Evolution, This View of Life, the magazine that approaches anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. This is my second interview on an important book called The Gardens of Democracy, a new American story of citizenship, the economy, and the role of government. Authored by Eric Liu and Nick Hanauer. My first interview was with Eric, and I'm very pleased to be talking with Nick today. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
This is great for me also. Now, Nick, you are a very successful entrepreneur and venture capitalist, one of the early investors in Amazon.com, I think.
Yeah.
And tell us a little about yourself and how you teamed up with Eric to write this wonderful book.
Well, I grew up in a family business and have been, running businesses my whole life. I mean, I started working for the family business when I was 7 years old and, helping out a little bit here and there, and then went into the business after college and helped manage it for a long time. And then, but in my early 20s, starting other companies. And by the time I was 35, I sort of left the family business to run different kinds of technology companies. But yet at the same time grew up in a very sort of civically minded family, and always been interested in policy and politics and civics. And through my work on public education, I met Eric Liu, and together we began to collaborate on a variety of civic and political projects, but really started with the book. Actually, a project which became the book, The True Patriot, in 2006 or so, and so that that project turned into a book, and the book was a lot of fun to write, and the relationship is very fruitful, and so we continue to collaborate. And The Gardens of Democracy is the second book that we've written together.
Great. Well, tell us about the theme of The Gardens of Democracy. I want it in your words, and then we can begin to explore some of the evolutionary connections.
Sure. So our view is that for a very long time, the American political process has been essentially prisoner to the battle between two very narrowly constrained and outmoded ideologies. On the left, this sort of big government 19th century paradigm that probably made a ton of sense in 1920 or 30 or 40, but makes little sense today. And on the right, the sort of very narrow libertarian notion about freedom and markets that, again, may have made some sense in 1775 when there were 3 million people in the United States, but makes no sense today. And for a long time, we've had the sense that there was a ton of opportunity in the sort of intellectual space, which was orthogonal to that very narrow left-right continuum,
right.
And a more modern approach to understanding ourselves and systems would create that space. And I suppose the fundamental thesis of the book is that when you understand the world systemically in a 21st century way, you have a very, very, very different perspective on how to create a successful society than if your ideas are rooted in a sort of 19th century post-Enlightenment view. And at the center of that, of course, is the work that you've done around understanding systems, complex systems like economies as ecosystems. And once you do, you have this incredible moment where you're like, oh my gosh, we have been thinking about this in a very unfruitful way. And the metaphor that we've been kicking around, the way in which we're trying to get people to understand how important this shift is to say that, for a very long time, human beings thought the Earth was flat, and their geography and navigation techniques were based on that. And in the same way that it's much more fruitful to understand the world is round and to navigate and do geography on that basis, if you still have the idea that economies, for instance, are linear closed systems in the way that traditional economics assumes they are, you're literally taking a flat Earth approach to economics. That you will you will have about as much success navigating economics as you would have navigating the Earth thinking it was flat.
Right, and so there's a lot of different ways that we can take this conversation. I definitely want to come back to this idea that something that's orthogonal to the current positions and something which is a new configuration of ideas that people can join on all sides. But let me begin, though, with this idea of this new understanding. You call it a second enlightenment, that we've learned so much now that we need to base our current policies on. And part of that has to do with an appreciation of complexity. Part of it has to do with an appreciation of evolution. And I know that you've learned a lot from Eric Beinhocker, as I have, in his wonderful book, The Origin of Wealth. Tell us a little bit about how you think about complexity and evolution.
Well, yikes, those are complicated questions. And as you know, one of our great challenges is to try to turn very, very complicated things into concepts that are simple enough to explain to people. I suppose the best way to frame it is to juxtapose old and new, and to say that, if you go from a mechanistic understanding of how a system like an economy works, and have it in your head, the metaphor of the machine, to an understanding of an economy as a complex adaptive system, like an ecosystem. And in fact, I think it's accurate to say that economies are actually a type of ecosystem. Your perspective on what will work and what won't work changes dramatically. There's another layer on top of that, which is that if you go from understanding the elements in the system in a 19th century way, which is to say that the elements are atomized, that they're disconnected, to a 21st century way of understanding elements in a system as networked, deeply connected, your perspective changes dramatically. And if you go from understanding the agents in the system, human beings, that is to say, from the traditional way, which is, the shorthand has been homo economicus, this idea that people are perfectly rational, perfectly selfish, and perfectly calculated, to a more modern understanding of human agency as not selfish, but rather strongly reciprocal, not calculating, but approximating, and not rational, but relatively emotional. And when you sum that up, you end up with an entirely different picture about how the world works, and therefore how you might construct policy and laws and approaches that will yield more fruitful results. And so, the important thing is to start to think of examples, and an example that we posited recently was that, the central conception of where prosperity comes from in sort of the American sort of, how would you put it, the political context is the idea that if you make businesses and rich people richer, that prosperity will trickle down from them. That if you essentially pour money as an ingredient into businesses and rich people in the form of tax breaks and so on and so forth, that jobs will squirt out the other side like donuts out of a machine or something like that. And that, again, if you have a mechanistic metaphor, either consciously or subconsciously in your mind, that approach makes perfect sense and accounts for why people are so adamant that this must be true. But if that metaphor is wrong, then of course it makes no sense at all. And in fact, it is wrong that economies aren't like machines; they are like gardens, or ecosystems, right? A garden's a form of the ecosystem.
Well, let's spend a little time on this, because especially since talking with you and thinking about metaphors, and the whole concept of metaphors is fascinating and important in its own right. Why we need them, why they need to be simple, why they need to be compelling, and how they can be compelling but lead to maladaptive behavior. All of this is part of what's on the table. But metaphors are a little bit tricky. For example, let's contrast the metaphor of an ecosystem and the metaphor of a garden. You employ both of those metaphors, but there's an important difference between them, which is that gardens need tending.
Yes.
Ecosystems are not tended.
No.
A jungle is an ecosystem.
It is.
And a jungle is not necessarily the kind of place we want to be. So
exactly.
And a very important part of your...
It's a very important distinction. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that the idea that an economy is something which, like a garden, needs to be tended. That's one of the most important part of the metaphor that you're developing. The ecosystem metaphor doesn't exactly do that particular thing. In other respects, of course, you're right that the economy is an ecosystem.
It is. But like a jungle is an ecosystem. It just turns out to be an ecosystem that humans do not survive well in.
Where life is nasty, brutish, and short.
Exactly. Jungles are characterized by two things: weeds and predators.
Yeah.
Neither of which are very friendly to humans.
Now, one of the things that I appreciate about your book is that you have a very strong sense of evolution that goes beyond genetic evolution.
Yes.
And as a professional evolutionist, I can tell you that many of my colleagues even are thoroughly gene-centric. Say the word evolution and they think genes. But when you use the word evolution, you think much more broadly about that.
Yes.
And I'd just like to hear from you how it is that you think of evolution as something which takes into account all of the rapid changes that are taking place around us.
Well, I mean, evolutionists, I don't know that many, but my impression is they tend to study animals and living beings, and they see evolution in that context. I study businesses, right? And what is so striking is that the processes that guide the evolutionary processes which guide how natural ecosystems develop are exactly the same processes that guide how commercial ecosystems develop. And if you substitute business for turtle, or whatever it was, I should mention I just got back from the Galapagos.
Oh, lovely.
Ground zero for evolution. You see the same things at play, and once you understand an economy as an ecosystem, what's happening in it, it becomes much more obvious, and your ability to predict what will happen and how to arrange it in ways that will be fruitful for the participants becomes much more transparent as well. So I think that Darwin did an extraordinary thing in the late 19th century, and then it took us another 100 years to discover, I think, how much broader the implications were of his work than he I'm sure, I presume, he ever expected. And that is that they apply to every complex adaptive system, essentially, including basically every corner of human societies.
Well, at the level of formal science, the study of cultural evolution is like biological evolution, and cultural diversity as like biological diversity, very much the ecosystem metaphor, is something which is only just coming into its own, even within the ivory tower, and but has so much to offer the world of public policy.
Yes.
That's of course what excites me about the fact that you've taken that and you've very eloquently expressed that in a way that just about anyone should be able to understand. That brings us to the simplicity of your book. You made it short. You made it beautiful. It's a lovely book to hold in the hand.
We tried.
And you really saw that this was needed, basically, that even if the science was there and fully developed, more would be needed in order to make this powerful as a cultural force.
Yes.
And that brings us to the power of metaphor. And once again, one could approach this from a scientific perspective, but I'm more interested to hear from you about why you understand that it's so important to message this the way that you are.
Well, I think that, so Eric and I have been working together now for a long time around and have devoted ourselves to both the business of creating and then creating ideas, right, or harnessing ideas, and then finding ways to get people to respond to and ideally accept new ideas. And so we have thought very, very carefully about this problem. It is a very difficult problem to get people to change their minds. As you know, if there's nothing that thousands of years of human civilization have proved, it is that, it is hard to get people to change their minds. And we have worked very hard on this problem, and we have worked with some very smart people on it. And among them, the granddaddy of, I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, of metaphor, George Lakoff,
yep.
Who has done some incredibly fruitful research on this subject and has made huge contributions. And what became quite obvious to us early in our work is that if people hold in their heads the wrong metaphors, facts simply bounce off their heads. Like there's this very interesting phenomenon, which is that you can be in a world where you hold the wrong metaphor in your head, and something can seem right but be wrong. It seems right that higher taxes would lead to less prosperity, but in fact it is wrong. If you look at, and all you have to do is look at the 195 countries in the world and examine the correlation between tax rates and prosperity. The G20, the only countries on Earth really that a reasonable person would want to live, all have high levels, in particular high levels of progressive taxation, and all of the poverty-stricken hellholes don't. And this is a great conundrum this is a great challenge to the position that higher taxes equal less prosperity. Clearly, they don't.
And a wonderful book there, just to praise another book to our audience, is The Spirit Level.
Yes.
By Wilkinson and Pickett,
right.
British social scientists, which just crush you with data, showing that the more equality a society has, or the more equality a state has within the United States,
right,
the better it is. There cannot be a stronger relationship between social equality and prosperity.
Absolutely. But I just want to, I think you raise a very good point, and there's a very interesting thing to be said about that, which is that the old paradigms, the old metaphors, force you to choose between capitalism and a high-functioning society, not capitalism, right? Like, so one of the conclusions you could draw from the spirit level is that we should eliminate all forms of inequality, and life would be better, okay? And this, of course, is as untrue as it's good that radical inequality is good. What understanding the world ecosystemically teaches you is that there is this marvelous happy medium. If you force everyone to be equal, that's death, right? And if you create a situation, essentially a tyrannical or not a tyrannical situation, a libertarian situation where the rich get richer and richer and richer until you have a society where a few people have everything and no one else has anything, that's also death, right? Yeah. But there is this happy medium that you can understand ecosystemically, and I think that's the important point about this approach, is it allows you to see these old problems in new ways and resolve old conflicts in constructive ways.
Well, let me just play that back a little bit my own way. We're such a cultural species that our social constructions and our mental representations truly influence the way that we see the world. And that, of course, influences how we act in this world. And so if you have the wrong metaphors, stories, theories, then they are going to be totally compelling. They'll seem completely right, but they'll cause you to act in a way that's completely wrong.
Yes.
And the only way that you can fix that problem is to change the metaphors, stories,
absolutely,
theories, and to have them in the first place. They have to be aligned to reality, so they have to be anchored in theories that are correct. But then they also have to be friendly to the human mind, and that's where they have to engage the emotions. They have to be transmitted simply And so there has to be what we have to create, as we've discussed privately, is a chain basically with really the best theory on one end and the most compelling message on the other end.
Yes.
That's what we're in the business of.
I could not agree with you more. I think you underscore a very important point, and that is that if you have the wrong metaphor in your head, the facts will bounce off your brain. Right? You simply a person who has a particular metaphor in their head simply will not either be able to see contravening evidence or be able to accept it. Again, use regulation as another marvelous example, right? So even the word regulation is rooted in a mechanistic metaphor, right? We regulate machines, right? And if you look up the word regulation, what you find is that the synonyms for regulation are all pejorative. It's to limit, to inhibit, to reduce, right? And so if the metaphor you hold in your head of the economy is mechanistic, then regulation by definition means to slow it down. It means to limit prosperity. It means to slow down the machine. And so in that way, all regulation is appropriately seen as counter to prosperity. But if you understand the economy ecosystemically and you understand the economy you're trying to create as a garden, then regulation becomes tending. It becomes the business of gardening. And in the same way that it would be ludicrous to let nature take its course with your garden and hope that it would yield the result you wanted, it is equally ludicrous to expect to have laissez-faire economics, right? An economic ecosystem where you simply let the weeds flower. Thought about it in this way, to a dandelion, everything should be yellow, right? The dandelion will make a very persuasive case that everything should be yellow, but a sensible gardener knows that a few dandelions here and there are no problem. Indeed, you can make wine with them, but we need carrots and potatoes and peas and the rest. And if we let the dandelions take over, yes, we'll have lots of growth, but that won't provide for the needs that we have.
Yeah. Well, I finished up my interview with Eric by asking him what his advice would be to three categories of people: a scientist, a layperson, and a politician. Let me finish up my interview with you by asking a related but somewhat different question. We both have a sense of urgency, basically, about the need to create this sort of sea change. And so, in general terms, your book is part of something that you're trying to do more generally. What are you trying to do in general? What are you driving towards? And how fast can it go? For example, could it influence the current election? Or over the longer term, what are you trying to establish?
I think Eric and I share your goal, which is to find ways to bring the broader public along, metaphorically and intellectually in this way, right? We need people to stop thinking about machines, to stop imagining the economy and the systems they inhabit mechanistically, and start thinking about them ecosystemically, or think about a garden. And when you do, if we can do that, we can create the conditions that will make much better policy possible. But I think that until we do that, it will be essentially impossible to enact or easily enact more sensible laws.
Right.
Why is it that otherwise reasonable people oppose regulation of the financial services industry, right? When it is so obvious how off the track that has gone. Because in their heads is lodged a metaphor which tells them that any regulation is bad by definition.
Right.
And so even though the facts are that the financial products industry, the financial services industry, essentially almost destroyed the country recently in the pursuit of their narrow self-interest, even though it's obvious that they are essentially dandelions in our garden. But people don't see it that way because they have this other metaphor lodged there, and it's our job to dislodge that old metaphor and put a new one in. We'll be better off.
Well, yeah, I just can't resist by saying that's what makes. I study religion, and a lot of people like to study religion, and they like to knock religion for being so detached from reality. But I think it's very important to state that that's not true only of religion. That's true of a ton of secular belief systems and political belief systems, and they're just as detached from reality, which is the problem that we're talking about. And that when you have a meaning system, religious or otherwise, which is powerfully motivating, seems to make sense of the world, but in fact causes you to misunderstand the world and therefore to behave in ways that are pathological. You've just got to change those meaning systems and bring people to their senses. And that's true not only of religions, some religions, but also true of some secular belief systems. And some of the economic worldviews are as deluded and as detached from reality as any fundamentalist religion.
And they are as deeply entrenched psychologically as any religion. I mean, what we call economic fundamentalism, the sort of idea that the market fundamentalism rather.
That's not just a pejorative. Actually, there's a sense in which which you can prove that market fundamentalism is fundamentalist in its rhetorical and symbolic structure, as fundamentalist as any fundamentalist religion. Well, I can see we could go on for a long time, but I'm so happy to have made this connection, and to hopefully we'll also continue the dialogue, and some of that will be represented on Evolution, This View of Life. So thanks so much, Nick. And
wonderful to talk to you. Thank you so much for the time.
Okay, this is David Sloan Wilson signing off for Evolution, This View of Life.